Montana Territory, April 1873. The wind was sharp that morning, cutting through the crowd like a knife as they gathered in the square of Red Rock Crossing. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and the air smelled of dirt, sweat, and something meaner shame. Next up, Victoria Odell. Age 23. No family. No dowry. No use, far as I can tell. The auctioneer barked, his voice cold. He pulled her forward by the arm, and the townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. Victoria kept her head high, but her cheeks burned red under the eyes of the crowd. Her hands were tied in front of her, wrists raw from the rope, her green dress torn at the hem.
She didn't cry.
Not anymore. She had cried when her father was hanged for horse theft. She had screamed when the boarding house turned her out. And she had begged when the sheriff locked her in a cell for vagrancy, just long enough to arrange this auction. Now, she stood silent. "Do I hear $20? The auctioneer asked. A man spat. "I've seen better stock in the livery." 10 then, the auctioneer pushed. Nobody moved. Victoria's hands trembled as a gust of wind lifted her hair. She caught eyes with a woman near the back clutching her son close. Nobody wanted a girl with trouble stitched into her name. $5, come on now, I'll pay 50. The voice was steady,
Deep.
rough-edged. Heads turned. A man stepped forward from the shadows of the mercantile awning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dust still on his boots and a trail-worn duster hanging open over his shirt. He looked like he had just come off the trail, and maybe he had, but the way he stood said he feared no one. 50, he repeated, pulling a wad of bills from the inside of his coat. The auctioneer blinked.
Sold, then. 2.
What's your name, sir?
Hale Hartley.
He walked straight to her, his boots crunching over the dry dirt. Victoria stared up at him, her throat tight. He did not look at her the way the others had. Not with pity. Not with disgust. Something steadier lived in his eyes, like he saw her, not just what had been done to her. He pulled a knife from his belt and cut the rope at her wrists. Then he wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "You are not a thing," he said, voice quiet but sure. "You are not shame. You are my treasure now." Victoria's breath caught.
She didn't speak. Couldn't.
But her eyes filled, and she nodded once as he helped her up into the saddle of his horse. He climbed up behind her. They rode out of Red Rock Crossing in silence. They traveled 2 days east, into the lower hills where the ridgelines bled into pine forests. Hale's ranch sat tucked in a wide valley, flanked by cottonwoods and a slow-moving creek. There were 3 horses, a small barn, a cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. It was quiet, safe. The first night, he gave her the bed and took the floor. The second night, she asked for his name again. He gave it, and this time she remembered it. On the third morning, she found a stack of folded clothes on the wooden chair by the stove. A soft cotton dress, warm socks, and a comb. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She hadn't used it in days. Hale handed her a tin cup of coffee. His eyes never left hers. "I do not want anything from you," he said calmly. "Not a thing. You do not owe me." "Then why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He looked out the window. "My wife died 3 winters ago. Fever. Town doctor was drunk. By the time I got back with help, it was too late." "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "I buried her up on the ridge. After that, I stopped talking to folks. Just worked the land." She studied his face. He did not speak with anger. Just truth. That drew her in more than anything. "I do not know how to be anything anymore," she said. "You do not have to be anything," he replied. "Just be." That night, she sat by the fire while he carved a handle for a new axe. He did not speak. She did not need him to. But when her fingers brushed his as she handed him a blanket, she felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. Not shame. Something quieter. Hope. By the end of the week, Victoria had planted a small patch of potatoes out back. It gave her something to do with her hands. She liked watching the soil turn under her fingers. Hale watched her from the porch sometimes, his face unreadable. But when she caught his eyes, he always gave a slow nod, like he was proud. She slept easier now, ate more, laughed once when a squirrel darted across her path and made her drop water from the well. That laugh stayed with Hale all day. One night, as the fire crackled low, she sat across from him and said, "You bought me, but you never treated me like you owned me." He set down his mug. "I do not believe in owning people, but you said I was your treasure." He looked her straight in the eye. "I meant it, not because I bought you, because I saw you." Victoria's hands curled in her lap. "I do not know what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything," he said softly. "Just let me keep looking." Her heart beat hard in her chest. She didn't reach for him. Not yet. But she stayed by the fire long after the flames died down, just listening to the sound of his breathing, steady and close. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel lost. The creek behind the cabin swelled with meltwater as April burned slowly into May. The air carried the scent of pine sap and wet stone, and the cabin walls held the day's warmth long into the evening. Victoria had taken to waking early, before Hale came in from feeding the horses and standing barefoot on the porch with her hands wrapped around a chipped enamel mug. She watched the sun climb over the ridge, without speaking. The hush of it steadied her. One morning, she caught the glint of metal in the field, Hale driving fence posts, shoulders moving in rhythm, a bandana tied at his throat. The land bent quiet beneath his care. She stood there longer than usual, cup cooling in her hand, until he caught sight of her and raised his arm in greeting, just once. She didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. Later that afternoon, she found him in the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his wrists. He was shaping a yoke for the oxen, his jaw set in concentration. She waited until he paused. "I'd like to learn how to use the wheel plow." He wiped his palms on his trousers. "It's heavy work. I didn't say I expected ease." He leaned his hip against the workbench and studied her face. "You've been through enough backbreaking things. That's the only kind I trust," she said. "Teach me?" He nodded, slow and deliberate. "Tomorrow. I'll show you how to watch the line." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Victoria." She looked over her shoulder. "You can ask anything of me. You don't have to wait for permission." She didn't answer, but when she stepped out into the light, her shoulders were set a little straighter. That evening, she laid out flour and lard and shaped biscuits, while Hale read from a worn book near the hearth. She didn't ask what it was. The sound of the pages turning was enough. When the biscuits browned, she placed the tin on the table and sat across from him without waiting to be offered. He passed her the butter without a word. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork. "You're not afraid of hard labor. But you flinch when I look at you too long." She didn't deny it. "I've been looked at like a wound. You're not one. I still bleed." "I know." She set down her knife. "What if I never stop?" He met her gaze, steady as a post. "Then I'll keep standing beside you until you do. Or longer." She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Victoria lay still beneath her blanket, listening to the roof creak. Then the floorboard shifted. She sat up. Hale stood in the doorway, holding out a folded quilt. "It's colder than it should be." She took it, her fingers brushing his. "You could have left it by the fire." "I wanted to be sure you'd take it." She drew it over her lap and looked up at him. "You don't act like a man who's owed anything." "I've owed more than I've paid," he said. "I'm trying to change that." She didn't speak again, not until he turned to go. "Hale." He paused. "I want to believe you." He nodded once. "Then I'll make sure you can." She watched him disappear into the dark. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. She pulled it tighter and lay back down, eyes open to the ceiling. The wind howled through the pines, but the cabin held fast. For the first time since she'd come to this place, she didn't dream of Red Rock Crossing. By mid-May, the soil had dried enough for the first turn of the plow. Victoria braced her feet and leaned into the wooden handles, the muscles in her shoulders pulling tight with each push. Hale walked beside the horse, guiding the reins and watching the furrow behind them. He didn't speak, but his presence at her side steadied her more than words could have. When they reached the end of the row, she dropped the handles and straightened, breath ragged. Sweat clung to her neck beneath her scarf. She looked down at the dark line they'd carved into the earth and let out a breath sharp with pride. "You've a good hand for it," Hale said finally, voice low. "I didn't think I would," she replied, brushing her palms on her skirt. "You didn't hesitate." He handed her a tin of water. "That's half the work." She drank, then passed it back. "I used to believe I had no place in the world. Like I was something misplaced." He studied her face a moment. "And now, I think maybe I was just waiting to land somewhere quiet enough to listen to my own self." They walked the field again, slower this time, the horse trailing behind. A meadowlark called from the tree line. Victoria glanced over at him. "What was she like?" she asked. It took him a few steps to answer. "Kind. Laughed easy. She was born in Missouri, but she never could sit still. Always wanted to ride out and see the next ridge. She sounds like she belonged to the land."
She did.
"I tried to give her a home that matched it." They stopped at the fence line, and she leaned her arms on the top rail. "I've never had a man speak plain with me," she said. "It's always been either silence or something that costs too much. I don't want anything from you. You don't give freely. I know that now." He looked at her a long moment, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small bundle of linen and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a silver hairpin, simple but carefully shaped, with a twist of metal at the top like a leaf.
"This was hers," he said.
"She wore it every Sunday." Victoria didn't move. "I've kept it for years," Hale continued, watching the pin glint in the sun. "I thought maybe one day I'd know who else it belonged to." She took it from his hand with care. The metal was cool against her fingers. "You're not asking me to wear it," she said. "No, you're offering." "Yes." She didn't answer, but tucked it into her apron pocket and held his gaze. That night, she stood at the wash basin outside, the moon rising pale above the pines. She unpinned her hair with trembling fingers and combed it through in long, slow strokes. Then, with deliberate care, she twisted it up and slid the silver pin into place. When she stepped inside, Hale stood at the hearth, stoking the fire. He turned when he heard the door. His eyes found the pin, and something shifted in his jaw. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I don't know what comes next," she said, voice quiet but certain. "You don't have to," he answered. "I want to stay." He reached for her hands and held them between his, rough calluses brushing her knuckles. "Then stay," he said. "Not because you owe, but because you choose."
Ido.
He didn't pull her close, not yet. But he lifted her hands to his chest and held them there, like a promise. Outside, the wind stirred through the grass. Inside, the silence between them felt unbroken and whole. She had crossed 1,000 miles of shame and silence to arrive at this place, and now, standing in the warmth of the cabin, she felt something settle inside her for the first time. Belonging. The spring rains came sudden and hard, turning the slope behind the barn to mud and drawing the scent of wet pine through the open cabin window. Hale stood at the table, oiling the hinges of the back door where the wind had strained it loose. Victoria sat nearby, sewing a tear in the linen curtain that hung above the hearth. Neither spoke for a while, both working by habit and the hush between them. When her needle paused, she said, "I used to think quiet meant danger. that something awful was waiting just outside the silence. He looked over his shoulder. And now, I think it just means peace, most times. He nodded once and returned to his work. The hinges creaked softly, then settled. Later, as the rain eased, Hale brought in a crate of salt pork from the smokehouse and set it in the root cellar. Victoria followed, carrying a small jar of dried currants she'd found tucked behind a sack of flour. She crouched beside him in the dim, earthen cool. "I never asked what brought you out this far," she said, her voice muted by the low ceiling. He placed the jar beside a coil of rope and sat back on his heels. "My father was a freighter. Ran goods between Fort Benton and the mines down south. When he passed, I took his wagon as far as I could stand. And this is where you stopped. This land didn't ask anything of me, just offered work and space to grieve." She traced her finger along the lid of the jar. "I used to dream of leaving Missouri. I'd draw maps in the margins of books, make up names for rivers I'd never seen." "You still draw?" She shook her head. "I haven't touched charcoal since the day they sold the family cart. It held all my things." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Then we'll get you paper. Pencils, too." She looked up at him, eyebrows drawn. "You do that?" "I do more than that, if you ask." They climbed the ladder together. She paused at the top and glanced back down into the shadowed cellar. "I think I'm starting to believe you. I'll keep giving you reason to." That night, the rain deepened to a steady patter on the roof. Victoria lit a second lamp and sat at the small desk Hale had built years ago, smoothing open a sheet of paper he'd found tucked in an old ledger. She stared at the blank expanse for a long while. When she finally set the pencil to it, her hand trembled. Hale returned from the barn, shedding his coat and hanging it by the door. He noticed her posture, the curve of her back, the way her fingers hovered over the page. "What are you drawing?" "A ridge I saw in a dream, with a sycamore growing sideways from the cliff." He crossed the room and stood behind her, close but not touching. "I'd like to see that one day." She kept drawing, voice quiet. "Maybe we already have." He rested a hand lightly on the back of her chair. "You feel like home." She stopped, pencil still in her hand. "Not a place I pass through?" she asked.
"No."
"A place I stay." She turned then, slow and deliberate, and looked up at him. Her eyes didn't search for doubt this time. "Then stay." He leaned down and kissed her, not with urgency, but with the weight of everything they hadn't yet said. Her hand found his, and she held it tight. The fire burned low beside them, and outside, the storm softened to a hush.
They didn't speak again that night.
They didn't need to. In the morning, there would be fences to mend and a mule to shoe, but for now, there was only warmth and the sound of rain against the roof, and the quiet certainty that neither of them would ever be alone again. By early June, the earth had hardened under the sun, and the fields shimmered golden under a sky that held no threat. Victoria rose before dawn most days now, not from restlessness, but purpose. There were rows of squash filling out, and 4 hens to feed, and a pie to bake before the heat thickened. When she stepped outside that morning, hair braided down her back and skirts lifted clear of the dew, Hale was already at the corral, mending a split rail. She walked to him with a steady step, a tin pail swinging from her hand. "I've been thinking," she said, setting the bucket down beside the fence. He hammered once before answering. "That usually means I'll be climbing a ladder or digging a hole." She leaned against the post, the morning sun warming her forearms. "We could build a second room. The cabin's good, but it's still your shape. I'd like to add a bit of mine." He set the hammer down and turned toward her, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. "What would it hold?" "I don't know yet. Maybe shelves. A window on the east side. Curtains I make myself." He nodded slowly. "We'll gather lumber after the next dry spell. There's a stand of straight pine near the ridge." She smiled, soft but sure. Thank you. He picked up the hammer again. You don't need my permission. I know, but I still wanted your yes. Then you have it. She left him to his work and returned to the kitchen. The pie browned evenly while she boiled water for laundry. The rhythm of the day stitched itself around her like a garment made to fit. That afternoon, they rode together to the ridge, where his wife rested. Victoria carried a folded cloth in her saddlebag. Hale dismounted first and cleared the path of fallen branches before she stepped down. They walked together to the small wooden cross, the grass grown high around it. Victoria knelt and laid the cloth at its base. On it, she placed a small sprig of sage from the garden and a square of muslin stitched with a single line of blue thread. I didn't know her, she said, her voice steady, but I carry respect for what she meant to you. And I thought maybe if she saw me here, she'd know I mean to love you honest. Hale's hand found hers, his fingers rough but still. She would have seen your worth in a breath. They stood a while longer, until the wind picked up and carried the scent of pine across the ridge. When they mounted to head back, Hale looked over at her. Would you want to marry me? She didn't answer right away. Her horse shifted beneath her. You're not asking because it's owed? No. Not because I need a name to wear? No, then yes, she said. I would. They wed under the cottonwood by the creek 3 days later. No preacher, just a neighbor woman from 2 valleys over who spoke the words clear and kind. Victoria wore a dress she'd mended herself, and Hale shaved for the first time in weeks. They stood hand in hand while the water ran behind them and the horses grazed nearby. I promise to leave space for your sorrow, she said. I promise to carry your joy like it's my own, he answered. When they kissed, it wasn't loud or long.
It was simply right.
A sealing of something already whole. That night, after the fire burned low and the lantern was out, Victoria lay beside him beneath the quilt she'd finished stitching that morning. Her head rested on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. I had a dream once, she murmured, that I lived in a place where no one remembered what I'd done, only who I was. He turned toward her, folding her close. You're there now. Years passed as they do. The cabin grew by one room, then another. A cradle was carved from pine and set near the hearth. The land gave enough to feed them and trade with neighbors. Letters came from Missouri once or twice, but none ever called her back. Victoria taught a few children to read in the winters, though her own son was the first to sit still long enough to learn. Hale taught him to ride, to mend harness, to listen to weather. They never spoke of Red Rock Crossing. They never needed to. Their life was not marked by grand gestures, but by the 1,000 quiet acts that made a home. A hand on a back. A coat hung near the stove. A worn silver pin passed from mother to daughter when the time came. In the end, they did not grow old alone. They grew old together.